if you or someone you know has established relationships, such as with AEF or Girls Inc. or the Boys and Girls Club or APC, that would be a fantastic role for you to come in to join this group and help facilitate those partnerships. We're still trying to get going on our subcommittees. I could definitely use some help with communications and getting out our periodic newsletter, helping out with posting stuff on social media. The district also uses Peach Jar for flyers now, so getting that going to get flyers out about our events or other events that we want to point people to. And lastly, definitely want to have people staying on the ground as far as what's happening with AUSD and the curriculum modifications that they're working on. I think there's a group that meets periodically to discuss the revamp that they're doing in the curriculum for various subjects. So I think Dr. Walton and Nancy Lai are the point people behind that. So if you want to get more involved in there, I would say reach out to them directly. I was hoping to see something come out this year. I know they had periodic meetings going on and during the fall of 2021 and the spring of 2022, and that seems to have faded in the background, though I know the work is still happening. So I'm hoping there's a way for us to be able to plug in there. And lastly, event planning. Apart from these meetings, what else could Alameda Mosaic be doing to get into the community and do some events to bring families together and champion advocacy? So if that's your jam, let me know and see what we can put together in the future. Any questions before I move on?
I wanted to let you guys know, I got in touch with Nancy about the curriculum, observed that they haven't had any community meetings. I brought in a group of people from the Franklin DEI committee to actually look at the materials, and that was super helpful. I actually want to go back because the 1 hour I allotted wasn't enough time. So if there's people in this group that are interested in going, I think it'd be really great to get a bigger group to show that there's community interest in this information. And I think they're looking at April, yes, Liz, for some decision making, which is coming up. Someone pointed out it was March already. So yeah, send me your names and then, or send Caroline your names and then she'll get them to me. We'll figure it out. But I do want to go back because I think there has been, she said that we were the first people to actually come and look at the materials, the physical materials, and have a dialogue with them.
Okay, without further ado, I would love to introduce our guest speaker for the evening, Dr. Jade Singleton, who is the strategic partner of Johnson Squared Consulting, a diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting company. Dr. Singleton has spent more than a decade leading impactful people and change strategies at the nation's top private and public sector organizations. She has produced, co-powered, and delivered DEI strategies, generative learning curriculums, communication campaigns, and workshops at agencies such as John Hancock, Siegel Bryant and Hamill, Freddie Mac, NASA, Women in Institutional Investments, ECS Federal, the Southern California Association of Governments, and the Association of California Healthcare Districts, just to name a few. Dr. Singleton holds a Master's of Leadership and Communications degree from Gonzaga University, where her thesis, Challenges to Leadership, African American Communication in the Corporate Environment, has been leveraged by academics and DEI practitioners alike. She also holds a Doctorate of Education from George Fox University in Instructional Design. Her dissertation focused on training approaches to corporate gaslighting, a forward-leaning DEI concept. And lastly, Dr. Singleton volunteers as a communications advisor at Valor Village, a nonprofit dedicated to helping families of justice-involved veterans to maintain and nurture their critical connections. So Dr. Singleton, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Delighted to be here with you all. I appreciate everything that you do. All right, so let's go ahead and get into it. Today, we're going to talk about some of the Black untold stories, and I wanted to take this approach specifically to curriculum. And if you move on to the next slide, I can kind of go over what we'll cover here. All right, so we've already done a brief introduction, so we'll talk a little bit about how we've largely been taught within scholastic environments. about Black history, about Black people just in general. We'll also cover kind of why it matters now in 2023. We'll talk a little bit more about where Black people actually come from. So not always starting with the slavery motif. And then we'll go into some of the more unexplored narratives. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about how we can change. So if that all sounds good, I will jump right in. All right. All right. All right. So when we're talking about American history and how it shows up in school curriculum, what we found is that there's very specific key themes that are focused on. And from an American history value perspective, you're looking at continuous refrains of, liberty, of self-reliance, on justice. There's a lot of justice motifs. The concept of freedom not being free, right? So you stand up for yourself, you're on the American frontier, you are determined for self-expansion and pursuit of happiness and protection of your own and your family, et cetera. And then when we look at how African-American history is largely framed within this kind of same lexicon, what we see is that the narratives and the motifs that come out of there largely focus on a dignified abuse threshold. So meaning there's, these particular characters, let's say a Martin Luther King type of character, and there's always that call back to, they withstood such abuse and they were able to do so in a dignified manner. They were able to integrate into sports in a dignified manner, regardless of how they were treated, regardless of how they may have been hurt or hunted. They were able to maintain their composure, and those are the individuals that are lifted up. There's also an element of noble codependency. So all of the stories largely focus on, there's been some collaboration with white people to kind of help you get where you ultimately need to go. There's been some emotion that these characters have been able to evoke through their own dignified abuse that kind of channels in some sort of empathy, and their cause is taken up, and then change takes place. So that's where you see that kind of noble codependency. The next thing that we often see is some element of forgiveness or failed resistance. So, the kind of the civil rights marching and preaching about forgiveness and kindness and God, kind of ringing true. The poems that are kind of focused on and read, all of the artwork that's typically displayed to weave in this type of African-American history largely focuses on these types of elements. From a failed resistance perspective, I'll give you a quick example. When we think about, let's say, slave rebellion, what do we typically hear about being taught in school? We hear about one in particular, and that's usually the Nat Turner Rebellion. And the reason why the Nat Turner Rebellion is focused on so much is because it was a failure. And so there's this kind of, there was an attempt, right? It was thwarted, it ultimately failed. Forgiveness and acceptance of abuse and remaining dignified and patient and kind will get you further than revolt, okay? And as you can see, these things are diametrically opposed. They couldn't be further apart. And so what happens when we don't have cultural pluralism, which is what's missing here, these are complete opposites. Essentially, you're alienating the African-American students from the larger American history story. So you have one side where there's this feeling that's designed to provoke and evoke a level of pride. And on the reverse side, you're seeing a lot of humility, a bit of shame and enduring patience. So, this leads to a lot of different things that we'll talk about as we move further throughout this presentation. But I just wanted to make sure to give that backdrop and kind of call that out. I'll stop there and ask if anyone has any questions or any thoughts. Does any of this seem right to you all as educators and parent advocates and what you've seen?
And we're a small group, so feel free just to come off mute. You don't have to raise your hand.
It's just awesome to see it so eloquently spoken. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely, Troy. Thank you.
So I was thinking when you said that, so my culture is Caribbean. So I'm African American, but I'm like Caribbean, African, whatever. And it's interesting when I learned African American history when I came up here. It was a different tone than like the Caribbean African
Yes.
story. Our story was about burning the whole place down and getting
Yes.
our freedom and being proud about it.
Yes.
The Maroons, all of
Yes.
us, like we learned about all of that stuff and we're very proud of it. And then I
Yes.
learned about African American history and it was like the tone was completely different. It was like sit down and shut up and take it. And
Yes.
and that's how we get our freedom. And it's just completely different from like the narrative that I grew up with and like like we celebrate those who fought like for us.
Yeah.
And it seems that unfortunately those fighters are looked down upon here, where I'm like,
Yes.
you should be proud of your fighters
Yeah.
because that's how you got there. Is that fighting
Right.
spirit? It's how you got free, to be fair. um
Yeah.
just maybe had to be changed a bit, but that spirit to not want to be there anymore is how you become free, or you just
Right.
become complacent. So it was
Yeah.
interesting when you said it. It just dawned on me when you said, I was like, oh yeah, that's right. Because the way I grew up is we're proud to burn everything down.
Where did you grow up?
I'm from the Virgin Islands. So
Okay.
on my island, literally they started from both sides and burned and killed on the way, and then the next day would. They're like, look, y'all, the Danish is like, here, have your freedom. We're good.
Yeah.
So
And it's interesting you brought up the Maroons because a lot of people don't know that there were that was almost a blanketed term that was used by white supremacists to describe these types of groups, of what they called rebel groups. They were actually armies. They were extremely strategic military operations, and that they existed here too. They were also called the Maroons. And so none of that is that's kind of eclipsed from our history. And is ever present, the Queen Nanas or Nancy's of Jamaica, etc.
Yep.
Of brothers and sisters in the Caribbean, the Dessalines, just entirely different. But thank you so much for bringing up that fantastic point.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, I think we can move on. All right, so just to give you a quick example about this, there was a really good article that was written by Brittany L. Jones. She's at Michigan State University. I will not read this to you because we don't have a lot of time. But even in thinking about this conceptually and how history is presented in classrooms, we note that I'm in Virginia, so I'm using a Virginia example. But fear was mentioned about 12 times throughout these texts. They never applied to Black people. They only applied to white people, and fear being placed as some sort of construct of power. So I'm going to go into just a couple examples to show you what I'm talking about around some of this, and I'll put what I was saying about those distinctions and those differences, make it kind of drive it home. So fear was leveraged as explaining that the white populations feared slave rebellions, right? And therefore they went ahead and executed these types of laws and Black codes and other types of mechanisms that were harmful and very painful for Black Americans, right? So each time you hear about it, it's like, well, this was driven out of a fear, out of a concern, but that's never afforded to Black people in any of these stories. For instance, an example might be, hey, Nat Turner's rebellion took place because they feared their children being sold, or something like that, right? That would kind of bring it home and show some cultural plurality. But what that does is it really diminishes the humanity of Black people overall. And it also provides like this kind of parallel between, this was done because out of fear, out of being scared of what, and who ultimately really should have had the ultimate fear here. So when we think about how these things are presented to students, we have to consider how this is ultimately internalized. So just wanted to provide you with those quick examples. I think they're pretty powerful ones around how we use language. Right. So let's talk a little bit more about like why this matters. And we hear the constant pushback around Black History Month and what's going on and why do we have to still keep talking about this and such a small percentage of the population, et cetera, et cetera. Well, we really need to talk about this as a country, especially in education, because it is costing us on the global stage. So I did a similar presentation, but was focused for investment bankers. And what we're seeing more and more is as countries in Africa become stronger and their economies are growing stronger, and some of these are very fast growing middle market economies that are reaching tremendous levels of where you could ultimately invest, they are electing not to work with the United States, not to work with Americans, and use different trade partners. And some of the reasons that are they're citing some of this is the paternalizing tone that is taken by Americans in doing business. This kind of posturing that takes place that, for this next generation of African leaders, they just can't take it, and a lot of it comes from some of these motifs, the lumping together of all Black people, the lumping together of the entire continent. And again, this very, this kind of storyline of, Black people really should be kind of grateful. We kind of got them out of this hole that they were in, this nightmare that they were in through, their meekness and their, winning our empathy. And this expands out into how business is done. And what we're seeing is that we're becoming smaller and smaller on the world stage when it comes to getting resources that we might need. And when it comes to getting partnerships, people are choosing to look and move the other way. They're choosing to say, is there another way that I can do business outside of the dollar? So when we're training up these kids, they're going to be entering into competitive spaces where they're going to need to know how to operate in a culturally plural way. And so that's why this is so important. So I went ahead and kind of highlighted a couple of key statements that are coming from the world of business, that are coming from presidents that are on the African continent, that are coming from the African Union ambassadors, really talking about this and saying, you need to train your people before we continue engaging. Okay. All right. And we can, I think, move on. All right, so one of the big things I think that's missing largely from curriculum overall is really where Black people even come from. So typically the history does begin with, there were some folks, they were in West Africa, if that's even covered. And then my favorite story is, they sold their people, and then they ended up here, right? So it's a very small-minded, very myopic view that just doesn't translate, and it's inaccurate. So there are a lot of different identities that the African Americans in this country today come from. And I've listed just a few of them, Igbo, Yoruba, Fulani, Edu, Bambara, Chambra, Wolof, Abron, Benga, Massa, Mandi. Mandi, if you're a Jackson 5 fan, this is where the Jackson 5 lineage comes from, the Mandi people. So you see there's all of these different peoples. And I have some pictures of, a Fulani gentleman, a Bakongo woman, and some Fon children here. This picture was taken in the 1930s. The distinctions and the differences are vast. They did not speak the same language at all. Some of them came from entirely different places in Africa. For instance, the Igbo came from toward the Nile River, some even further down into the Sudan area, and had migrations over thousands and thousands of years. So their stories and their histories are entirely different. So when you look at things like, for instance, the Igbo, when you look at their writing, which is called Nisbiti, you see hieroglyphic style writings and things that are left over from trade with the ancient Egyptians. And so, part of what I think is really important that's often missing is telling the actual story of what was going on within West Africa at the time of the slave trade. So you had these different ethnicities, and I want to specify that these are different ethnicities because we can do genetic testing, which African Americans are able to do now and find their ethnicity, right? Not just the location of where they were, but these people actually have different genetics. And the wars that took place and were fought there over resources. And so when people say, well, they sold their own people, well, no one says that about what happened with the Spartans, against other groups in Rome, right? It was the same kind of construct. So thinking about it in that framework can be detrimental, right? And so, for instance, the Igbo that I was speaking about just a few moments ago, there were great wars that were taking place with another kingdom called the Oyo Empire. And the Igbos were largely undergunned, really. And so in order for this other group, the Daomi, to pay tribute, they would often take Igbo, okay, and they would sell them, all right, so that they could defend against the Oyo Empire. So these were completely different ethnicities leveraging each other during a time of war, battling with each other, and then ultimately selling their adversaries, okay? Right. The other thing I want to mention very quickly is that the concept of slavery is not really even explored that much. The differences between what existed in West Africa and the chattel slavery that existed in America. If we can go back to, let me see quickly. Yeah, we can stay here. I think that this is really important because when we talk about even just in general, the concept of slavery, it didn't exist in Africa, in what I'll say in West Africa, did not exist in the same way that it did in America. Meaning there was no concept of your child would be a slave, then your child's child would be a slave, then your child's child for all, for 400 years. It was not a concept that existed. What would happen is if you were a slave in West Africa to a different ethnicity, you would be absorbed within that tribe or within that ethnicity. And so, meaning ultimately you could rise to the level of chief, you could move through the ranks, you were free to marry. It was almost similar to what happened in Europe with, serfdom and indentured servitude. So this concept of you being a slave for the rest of all, throughout your generations, no matter what you do, you cannot get out of slavery, was not a concept that existed. And this is often written about, the European traders wrote about this, about these African chiefs not understanding that the slave concept being so very different. Some of these ethnicities did not even have a word for slave. They didn't practice slavery at all. So there was no even terminology for what was going to happen once the slave trade began. I'm going to stop there and ask if anyone has any questions or any thoughts. All of this old news, because always pipe in and let me know, like, we already know this, you're boring us to tears in the evening. All right.
I was just going to say, this is some awesome information. It's really good to know because the time you spent on distinguishing the ethnicities is really important. My children are biracial, and my husband and my daughter have Yoruba names. And just to try to go back and plan a trip around where their names come from in the near future, this is going to be some awesome highlights to, consider while we decide to go out there. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Love the Yoruba. I actually have Igbo and Idu lineage, so right around the corner. All right, and we can move on. Right. The other thing that's typically not taught is if we can go back to that previous slide really quickly. I know we only have a little bit more time. There's kind of this refrain of Africans not being able to read and write, and it's just kind of throughout. And I think that what's missed here is that plenty of Africans could read and write. They could not read and write English. A good percentage of Africans that came here were Muslims, and a good percentage of those Africans could write beautifully in Arabic. In addition, a lot of them had done trade for many, many years. Before there even was a slave trade, they'd done trade with the Portuguese. So some were able to speak Portuguese. They've done a lot of dealings with the French, especially when we're talking about the palm oil trade. So the concept of, just not having a religion or not having a mastery of language is just a falsity. Actually, the gentleman that's before you, Omar ibn Said, his journal about his, the passage here to the Americas, etc., was written in Arabic. And what we also know is that some of the gravestones of African Americans who were enslaved are also written in Arabic, and we can see their practices, Muslim practices, in their gravestones facing the east. Certain practices that they perform, trying to hold on to their religions. On the other side, you see an ikenga, and this is something that was practiced in the Igbo tradition, which a lot of African Americans have Igbo lineage, a very large proportion, actually. They say that at least 1 in every 4 African Americans can trace back to some Igbo ancestor. And this ikenga was a way for an individual to capture or encapsulate their creativity, their genius, what they called their chi. All right, and this was an extremely deep religion. As far as just the astrology on its own, the mathematics that was involved in some of this, it's unbelievable, unreal. And so, these weren't, when I say that these people were, some of them were very educated, when I say that there were astrologers, when I say that there were, like this gentleman, Omar ibn Said, was a scholar, I'm not saying that lightly. There were captured geniuses, genius scientists, etc. And so down here at the bottom, you can see where Dr. Bashir Lowe talks about this, from Duke University, specifying, that especially the Fulani and the Fon were extremely literate, and actually more so than the average Western European, because the people of these regions had to speak multiple languages, and Arabic was the language that was taught in a lot of schools. Okay. All right. And we can move on. All right, awesome. I'm not going to spend too much time here, because I already kind of emphasized the wars that were taking place. But I do want to mention that when we talk about what the Europeans encountered when they went into some of these cities and into some of these regions, is very clear. They saw extremely well-designed engineering. The ancient city of what is now modern Benin was called an architectural wonder by European scholars. The aqueducts they compared to Rome. And so the comparative between what was developing in Europe and what was developing in ancient Africa were extremely comparative. They talked about the street lights, which was something that did not exist in Europe at the time in this particular city of Benin, leading up, and all the way around, these kind of circular style roads, the immensity of the walls, again, the engineering and the infrastructure that was put in place. Here's another Benin bronze. A lot of these things you can see in museums in England. Once these cities were torn down by the British, they took thousands and thousands and thousands of these types of works of art, that you don't develop something like this that you're seeing here, a Benin bronze, with no skill. You don't develop something like this when you're only at the lowest level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's engineering and it's architecture, but also how they were governed. That's the other thing around, the democracy that existed as well, that was ahead of its time. As much as folks say there was no kind of written language, there was no reading and writing in West Africa, there are documents that show and indicate rulings from, judgmentships where you had someone really sit before a trial and jury and what the ultimate outcomes would look like and what they would be. And those are, again, kind of sitting in European museums today. All right. I'm going to stop there and just ask if anyone has any questions or maybe anything to add.
I had amusing, I wonder, I guess. It's a wonderment. So I know the story as it would be portrayed to us is that Africans were just running around with the lions. They didn't know what they were doing, blah, blah, blah. But every civilization started as a civilization, right? So if you just use your brain a little bit, like, that doesn't make any sense, right? I wonder if a lot of this art, like, as our civilization, I know it's kind of coming to a reckoning, maybe, hopefully, if some of this can go back to where it came from.
Yeah.
Like, it's just sitting here, like, watching it, it's like, this was stolen, like, from many,
Yeah.
like, every other colonized area by the British. It was stolen from its home. It was stolen from its people. This history was stolen from its people, period.
Mm-hmm.
They
Yeah.
have museums as well. Like, give back what's not your history, what's not your culture to their people so that they can be proud of what they created instead of having to catch a flight to, like, London to see their stuff. Like, it just made me angry for like,
Yeah,
because it's like, oh,
yeah,
Africans are stupid. Africans are like blah blah blah. And then it's like, you see all of the art and even the art that is there already and still being developed. Because that's the thing is, it didn't stop just because they stole all of this stuff.
Right.
You can't steal it from the people when it's in here.
Right.
But it's still like, this stuff is beautiful.
It is.
But
And
it's
I think
also their history.
Yes.
So,
And
like, give it back.
yeah. And it's really interesting because I think one of the chiefs of Benin was talking about, there's also, I guess I can send it to you all. One of Nigeria's most brilliant novelists did an entire presentation about this to, I think it was a German audience. It's so powerful. I'll include it. I'll send you all a note with that link. But one of the Benin chiefs talked about this and said, the concept of having these things behind a wall, like for people to look at, is very strange. They're used. So these are things that would be passed down through, many, many years, which is why they've been able to retain so much. So when I was talking about that being one of the issues, with folks saying, well, where are they going to put all of this precious art? Well, if you have civilizations who were trading with ancient Egyptians and you're able to excavate that work from then, well, then they were able to retain it for quite a few thousands of years without any help. So the concept of putting these things in some sort of place, it just doesn't translate. These are things that are used to get closer to one's ancestors. They're used and developed to remember. The gentleman you see before you, that was done in remembrance of who he was. The Akangas, that was designed for someone's literal spirit and who they are. They would take that and you would look at that and it would give you strength and it would give you power. It wasn't to be behind a wall. They are working on getting some of this back. And it's taking time, but slowly but surely, I think it's coming to pass. Great point. All right, I think we can move on. All right, so let's remember at the beginning of this talk when I was talking about the areas where no one focused on, like on the, there was no cultural plurality, like where was the self-reliance? Where's the freedom isn't free? Well, now we're gonna get into a little bit more of that to kind of help balance some of these viewpoints that we're often taught about out with the truth. All right, so one of the things that is often missing from the history books is this, the concept of kind of self-freeing. Freedom isn't free as it applies to African Americans, but that was absolutely the case. You had areas like in Virginia down through North Carolina called the Great Dismal Swamp. And so African Americans armed themselves with stolen weapons from plantations, organized themselves into militia, again, often referred to as maroon groups, worked with particular Native American ethnicities, and lived in these areas and built entire existences in these communities, not fleeing to the north. We often hear about the Underground Railroad, which absolutely existed, but there were holds in the South where if your enslaved person got to that particular area and into that swamp, you let them go because they were so fierce with their defense. And so this existed, the Great Dismal Swamp existed in 1620, and it's remained in existence, operating, fully functioning, fully weaponizing and arming themselves until 1865. So right when the Civil War ended and folks could kind of come above ground. And now I really want to specify too, over time, as they'd adapted to this environment, the swamp wasn't like they were living in swamp weeds and like only coming up for air on occasion. These were actual well-designed. I mean, they had built dams, again, looking at that architecture and that architectural brilliance and engineering their way around. These artifacts from how they lived are still being excavated by the Smithsonian today. So these were not, as folks would portray it in some movies, as folks kind of coming out of a swamp. They had built fully functioning homes, cabins, etc. So one thing I wanted to also mention there is look at the term that is used for the swamp, right? Dismal. There were a lot of stories that went around during these times, during slavery, which was like swamp monsters, right? And we continue to see that all the way up through the 20th century, these swamp monsters. And if you get caught in the swamp, the monsters were going to kind of come out and get you. Well, something might come out and get you, but it wasn't a monster. It was, probably a Native American or a self-freed Black maroon. The other thing is that I also wanted to mention here that you can see this gentleman right front and center is John Horse. And this was the most effective, largest slave revolt that ever existed. And so while we often hear about Nat Turner, we never hear about John Horse, which is incredible to me. John Horse, from very early on in his life, he was part Seminole and part African American. He developed these really complicated, brilliant military strategies and led both Seminoles and African American self-freed men on this journey from the Florida area all the way down into the Mexico areas, and they beat the U.S. Army on multiple occasions to the point where they were allowed just to be free, to be let go, and to live their lives in peace and prosperity, which is ultimately what they ended up doing. This is where you get Afro-Mexicans from. They are a part of this renegade military strategery, well-organized group, led by John Horse and the Black Seminoles, who essentially freed themselves and, kind of went along all of those plantations, as many as they ultimately could, burning them down, freeing additional enslaved persons, and moving forward with groundswell and getting away. The other group that I wanted to quickly talk about are the Gullah Geechees. And I know many of you probably on the call are familiar with Gullah Geechees and Gullah Geechee culture. But the Gullah Geechee fought wars right around that kind of same place around where the Black Seminoles were, beginning in 1789. And it was 3 of them that were pretty major. And again, this was against the United States Army, and they won 3 times. And ultimately, they were freed, right, as far as living within their own specific district and being left alone. They had mounted their own defense and proven themselves as really great warriors. And to this day, the Gullah Geechees live with their own form of language, as a result of, having freed themselves very early on from, this horrible slavery construct. So it's interesting to me that the only things that we typically hear about within our kids' curriculums are about the failed slave revolts, and not these very large, extremely successful slave revolts. And there's a lot of context around why I think that is. I think, again, it doesn't fit into the docile dynamic. It's also important to note that at least 2 of these wars was fought on behalf of Black women. So a mistreatment happening to Black women in particular. And this was kind of a groundswell and an outrage upon which these warriors were able to come together and liberate these folks. And that's also not a story for some reason that folks want to, really tell, that kind of connection of self-defense and of justice, right? Because we talked about how that motif really resounds and resides in the American history lexicon. And what better form of justice is there than to defend someone who is defenseless? Well, that's what John Horse, the Black Seminoles, and the Gullah Geechees did on behalf of those that were defenseless. Right. I'm going to stop there and ask if anyone has any questions or maybe anything to add.
There was just one more thing I wanted to. I remember you said something earlier, and it caught me, but I just let me let you go ahead. But you mentioned the queens, and it was so funny because we call them queens as well. So a lot of the people who, well, you don't see this a lot in the history books here, but in history books back home, a lot of the people who started the uprisings, as they call them, or the fights, were the queens.
Yeah.
So like for me, the one thing that every child that grew up in I know is Queen Bottom Belly. We actually say Queen Bottom Belly, and her name was Queen Mary. And so we call these women queens. And so when I heard you say that, I was like, I've never heard an African American say that. I was like, oh my God, yes, that's what we call them.
Yeah.
And so they were
Absolutely.
fierce. Them women were fierce, saying, there's a queen dance and, all of that stuff. And so when you said that in defense of women, like a lot of these uprisings were because the women were being treated badly. And
Yes.
so they were like, we're not doing that anymore.
Yes.
Especially since we're in your houses, we take care of your children and cook your food,
Right. Yeah. And what's a really good point? Because some of these roles were really just taken from what was practiced in West Africa. So for instance, I mentioned the Dahomey, the people now of Benin. The women were the military strategists, meaning they would put together the planning, and some would fight too, but for the most part, they would put together these plans. You saw a lot of this when we're talking about what took place in the Haitian Revolution. And one of the things that Napoleon said was that they're difficult to defeat because they fight like women. And he didn't mean that in a glorifying way, but he meant the vindictiveness, the hell hath no fury, the kind of sneaky nature, that rage that, is sometimes applied to a woman scorned, right? And so the reason that they were fighting like women was because women were doing the design. It was also, I believe it was Dessalines' godmother, who was a Daomi warrior, who came up with the designs to beat the French, and how to do so and how to do that. And the men would kind of take that intelligence, go out and fight. So you saw a lot of that connectivity throughout. So excellent point there, Joya. All right, I think we can move on. All right, so quickly, I won't spend too much time on this, but another thing that we often see missed is just the self-reliant business practices. So when we talked about American self-reliance, rarely do we hear about African-American self-reliance. And African-Americans, they talk about maybe 2 communities when there were hundreds of communities, especially post-Reconstruction, that were doing extremely well. I mean, all the way I can talk about Wilmington, North Carolina. I can take it, to the traditional one that everyone knows about, the Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Black Wall Street. You can talk about the Harlem of the South, which was Jackson Ward in Richmond, Virginia. I mean, the list goes on and on and on of these self-sufficient Black enterprising entities from a political standpoint, and otherwise, just throughout history, throughout time, but especially if we're talking about the Reconstruction period and slightly post-Reconstruction. So whenever I kind of give this talk, there's always kind of that thing in the back of folks' head, like, well, if they had all this stuff, right, and they had all this money, and they had all these mansions, and they had all this great living, why don't they have it now? And one of the things that I challenge people to do is look at each and every one of those communities. There's lists of them, you can find them, and then look at the parallels around what happened to each of them. So if you want to look into what happened in Tulsa, which was the only time a bomb was dropped on an American city or an American, on American soil to kill American citizens, you can, if you want to look at what happened, let's say in Jackson Ward, where Black people, wealthy Blacks, were trying to kind of integrate into some of the larger banks, because you can only do business from an insular point for so long, how they were trying to do that business and every single dime was taken from them and never repaid. You can talk about the flooding that would happen in some of these communities as they had began to build, a lot of wealth. Take a look at what happened around Fulton, Georgia, and Lake Ligonor, where, those people were drowned to death, all of them. And you can just keep going down the list. Wilmington, North Carolina, where Black people were doing exceedingly well and politically and otherwise, and doing trade, and the riots and the genocide that happened there. I mean, and this list can continue to grow all the way up into the 1970s, where the self-enterprising, self-reliant, safe areas that were built continue to be cannibalized. So when people say, well, this particular group was able to make it, why can't Black people? I mean, we came here and we didn't have anything. My question is always, show me where your group was consistent with this level of consistency. Every single time you were able to build, you were burned down, you were bombed, you were killed, you were drowned, every single time with no let up at any point in history to date. And no one can find me that because it doesn't exist. And so I think the big thing here is especially when we're talking about this in the history books, is to not just focus on the National Negro Business Leagues and to focus on them as if they were has-beens. Talk about what happened to them and then the time that it would take to build that up. So I'll give you an example. You build up Tulsa, you make millions and millions of dollars. You build hotel chains that are the best in the area, which they did. You end up being bombed for no reason of your own doing whatsoever. You lose absolutely everything. Your children have nothing, you have nothing, and half of your community has been killed. What does that child have to start with now? Nothing. So you're essentially having to start all over every time. So we see this with gentrification too as well. A lot of people don't know that Central Park area was actually an all Black enterprising area. So it was called Seneca Village. And, we can look and see what ultimately happened to them for their removal. So part of what I would love for educators to do is to focus on how this impacts generations afterward, instead of just saying they had this and they just foolishly, what did we just start picking up gambling habits, or did we all? No, I mean, it was systemic with no ceasing. So I'm going to stop there and ask if anyone has any questions or any thoughts around any of this.
I have a question for you, Jade. I was there, my African-American son was listening to this. He's a senior in high school, and he said he's never heard anything like this in his 13 years of education. So it made me think about, are there any schools out there or any areas that are doing a good job of, making them comparative and that are showing both sides? Are there because it seems like when we talk to the school district, it's like, this is a Herculean effort to make these changes, and it's going to take 2 decades is what it feels like. And I'm just, I can't imagine that there's not stuff already out there that could start improving this for our children.
Yeah, I think that, I don't know of a school that's doing this well, and I've advised at schools, and I don't know, and I'm not saying there's not, because of course I'm not completely and entirely in that space. I know that in my state, there's not. I think there's a reluctance to share this information because it really does shake foundations and it shakes entire belief systems. So if you believe this about Black people, I'll put it this way. Part of the American identity for a lot of folks is Black failure. It's the barometer that folks want to compare to. It's the barometer that folks want to be able to say, see, they can't get their neighborhoods together and it's of their own doing. So there's some element of that. And so without that, what really are you? There's a sentiment that it diminishes the other's accomplishments, which it does not. But that whole mindset shift would take, and it is Herculean, because that whole mindset shift is revolutionary. And it would take a lot of shaking of a lot of cognitive dissonance change to take place. So what I always recommend is, doing the self-education. I always would interrupt my kids because a lot of the learning that I would hear was just so off base. I would just take them aside and say, no, actually, this is what happened. It wasn't folks marching around and allowing themselves to be beaten that got you your freedom. It's not true. The entire country was on fire. 100 cities were on fire. And that's when they signed, the Civil Rights Act. So it's kind of giving them the additional component to it and finishing out for ourselves. Because what they're saying, some of it is perfectly true. It's just not the whole story. So I think pairing it, can be useful and helpful, but I just don't see it happening. I wish it would, but I don't see that happening. I think it shakes too much up for folks. All right, and I think we can move on. All right, so very quickly, the last place that I really want to talk about and focus on, because we've kind of moved quickly, we talked about like Reconstruction period areas and stuff, is a place called Mound Bayou, and this was in Mississippi. This was a self-defense port, a self-defense area of refuge, of enterprise, of wealth, and safety. And so Mound Bayou was basically founded in 1887 by freedmen. It was heavily guarded. So a lot of the people that you hear about in the civil rights movement stayed in Mound Bayou. So everyone, I mean, I can run down Medgar Evans, Martin Luther King, anyone who was anyone during the civil rights movement would stay in Mound Bayou for protection, okay? So their own schools, their own pools, all of that. They also had armored vehicles so they could take civil rights activists where they needed to go safely. And so you never really hear about these people, but there's a whole book. It's called This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed. And it talks about the Black farmers who would arm themselves to protect the youth, the freedom riders. It talks about, these areas like Mound Bayou that, again, were, run by folks who would take turns kind of arming the community and providing security so that protesters and people who were advancing civil rights would have a safe place to stay. Emmett Till's mother spent time in Mound Bayou. It was really a place where you could ultimately relax, finally feel safe because you had an actual defense. One of the big lies, I think, of the whole civil rights era was that there were these very, very skittish, or every Black person was this very skittish, scared person. I never could contend with that because I had like grandfathers that were very tough. I couldn't imagine them, like anybody, coming into our home and harming a soul and making it out. I didn't understand where these solemn, scared Black people were. And these men don't look like the type either that were going for that. People knew who they could attack and they knew who they could not attack. In the book that I just mentioned, I love the one of the gentlemen that was interviewed was saying how, yeah, there was white supremacy, and yes, it was violent, and yes, it was terrible, but a lot of them weren't willing to die. A lot of them were not willing to come into certain areas like that and really kind of wipe out the community. The belief system wasn't that strong that they were willing to sacrifice their own lives in everyday, day-to-day type of life. So these kinds of enclaves, would exist and ultimately, would remain. So I think that was all I had. I don't think I have another slide, Caroline, but I hope, how we can change this. So just take me a second. All right, so one of the things I wanted to quickly mention is just when we're talking about, a curriculum, thinking about the community versus characters, there's a tendency to really focus on what Black people refer to as the talented 10th. So like there's these 2 or 3 Black people that somehow are aberrations and they were able to make leaps and strides. They came from somewhere, they came from communities. And so focusing on the community kind of versus just these onesie-twosie characters is really helpful. I think taking a culturally plural approach like we did today, where we're kind of pairing American value, American pride with African-American value and American pride, and showing those congruencies is super important. And I think tying these findings to the current state that we're in today, like we did at the beginning, where we talked about how some of these more myopic motifs are kind of costing us on the international trade front, on business fronts and in emerging markets is super relevant as to how folks are able, the kids are going to have to ultimately be going into negotiations. The world order is going to look entirely different in the next 10 to 15 years if the global economy continues forging ahead like it is. So it's our job to really get them prepared for that. So making those tie-ins, I think, is extremely, extremely useful and helpful. And with that, I've run out of time. So I want to say thank you all for listening, and I hope that this offered some insight.
Thank you, Dr. Singleton, for a fantastic presentation. I learned so much. The first time I heard you deliver this presentation to a client, I knew I wanted to bring it before this group because I knew it would be riveting and that folks would really appreciate it. So before I let Dr. Singleton go, because it is super late on the East Coast, does anyone have any questions or anything they want to say?
Yes, doctor, do you have any material that you have for sale, like maybe some literature you've written or some points of reference that we can continue educating ourselves with all the information that you share with us this evening?
Yeah, so I will give you the presentation. I do have quite a few links that are in there that might be useful to you, of some scholars that are really focused on kind of doing this work as well. So I'll make sure to get that on out for you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so very much. This was very eye-opening for me.
Great. Thank you so much, Carmen. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I also wanted to echo that. Thank you. Thank you for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Joya. All righty. All right, ladies, it's been an absolute pleasure to meet you all, and hopefully we'll stay in touch. I'll send you all an email pretty shortly here.
Well,
Thank
please show Dr. Singleton
Thank
some
you.
love.
Bye-bye.
Have a good night.
You too.
Super excited to share. I'm super excited to share with you. You might remember a few months back in October, I had shared some information about a documentary called The Right to Read, which explores the difficulty that students have in receiving education and literacy that is effective, that is actually teaching children how to read. So this documentary is right now streaming for free until March 9th. See if I can copy this link and drop it in the chat. If you hang on after I stop sharing this slide, I will drop that link in the chat. But please, if you have some time, I think the documentary runs a little bit more than an hour. It is absolutely worthwhile watching. This is kind of like the dirty little secret in America about how literacy curriculums are really failing our students. And as we can expect, it is particularly negatively impacting our Black and Brown students. One of the featured folks in the documentary, his name is Kareem Weaver. He is, I think, the chair of the education committee for the NAACP in Oakland. So he is one of the featured folks and responsible for the production of this documentary. So again, I highly recommend watching it. It gets into the differences between a balanced literacy curriculum that is taught widely in schools across America and has been for decades versus a structured literacy curriculum, which gets into phonemic awareness, reading comprehension, and all of the different components needed to be a good reader. So yeah, I highly recommend watching this documentary. It's extremely powerful and free until March 9th. I think you might have seen my message about the upcoming principal interviews to fill the soon-to-be vacant positions at Earhart, Milan, and Payton Elementary Schools. So please shoot me an email at alamedamosaic@gmail.com if you're interested in serving on an interview panel. I'm waiting to hear back information from HR with specifics because I think the positions are still posted, so they're not quite yet forming the interview panels. I wanted to put in a plug for our next meeting. So the meeting we had today was rescheduled from the end of February because it landed in the middle of ski week. So we're still going to have our regularly scheduled March meeting, which is going to be on March 29th at 6:30 p.m. However, we are taking a short hiatus from the book club. Our book club meeting got rescheduled in February to early March. So to give folks time to get the book, once I get the book pick out, we're going to meet on April 21st at 7 p.m. at a location to be determined. What I've tried to do is alternate East End to West End. So last time we met on the East End last week at Town Tavern. So next meeting will be on the West End. So if you have suggestions, I'm all ears. If you have suggestions for the book club pick, I'm all ears. I hope to see you all there.
Said something in the chat. I put something in the chat about another podcast that I've been listening to. It's called Solda's Story. I don't know if you guys have heard of it.
I've heard of it. I haven't been listening to it, but it's in my
Oh my
library.
goodness. I think that every parent, teacher, principal, everybody should listen to that. It is eye-opening to the way our kids are learning and the way they're been teaching them and the way they're not learning. So just, FYI.
Yeah, so if you're interested in volunteering to help with Alameda Mosaic, whether it's helping to get the subcommittees formed or being an ambassador or helping out with communications, we welcome you, and please feel free to share that amongst your networks because we could definitely use some more help in doing all the doing. Thank you, Elizabeth, for sharing that Challenger Baseball is starting this weekend. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
I don't know much about it because we're new to it, but I'm excited. And the program that they ran for soccer in the fall was really well run. They had a student kind of pair with your kiddo, and they just ran these games, and the kids had a lot of fun. And they had a lot of families coming back, so it's a good program. I'm not familiar with the baseball part, but we're gonna try it out.
They've done the baseball for a while. They started that about probably
cool.
6 or 7 years ago. So yeah, it's a good
Is that the program for participants with varying abilities?
Yeah.
Yes.
Little League runs it.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing. Summer on the Green at Corica Park. I don't have the details yet because I think they're still pulling the schedule together. But look out for that. So Greenway Golf ran a great program called Summer on the Green, specifically to get kids who wouldn't normally get exposure to golf to come out and play. Iris, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I sure do. So we for Corica, there is a couple programs going on. There's also a golf group that happens bi-weekly for boys from 8 a.m. to 9:30 and girls from 9:45 to 11:15 bi-weekly on Sundays. You do have to talk to the director, which is Tamara. She's a very sweet lady that we met at the Equity Potluck last summer. She and the new, I wouldn't say new, but some of the investors now at Corica are trying to bring equity and diversity and inclusion to the golf course. And they also have some clinics going on for women's clinics. If you'd like to go up there on your own and have a new network of friends or bring some of your friends up there. She also asked me to put the word out that the golf course is available to everybody. There is a thing I don't know if you guys are aware of this thing called foot golf that my son has had a couple play dates up there. It's really awesome. It's basically the kids using their foot instead of a club. And they have different holes to go through. So if you want to get them nice and tired for nap time, it's a great activity for them to do with their friends. They can go hang out at gyms when they're done, get some French fries or something and a milkshake and have a great time. Another thing I want to say is if you want to have an event there, a wedding, a get together, a celebration of some sort, she's also looking to get the word out that, that's an option for you as well. As far as the biweekly program for boys and girls, Orion and Lonnie have both attended. They love it. It's a clinic. There is a coach, Nick, that is responsible for the program. And the sessions last 90 minutes on Sunday mornings. So if you want more, you should reach out to Tamara, more information. At Corica Golf Course, and I'm not sure. They're also on Instagram. If you need to find them, you can probably find some contact information on their website.
I have a book club suggestion too. So my friend just bought me this book. It's called Emergent Strategy. I have not read it. I want to read it. So if it could be considered, it looks really good. I just need some, I think, motivation to read it.
You need a strategy to read it.
Exactly.